During the latter half of the 20th century, many iconic vintage legacy carriers would eventually find themselves going Tango uniform and becoming history. Some of these airlines included Pan Am, TWA, Eastern, Continental Airlines, etc. However, one airline in particular was forced to put on the Tango uniform out of greed and pressure. This airline is none other than National Airlines, a Miami-based airline that was deliberately forced to merge with Pan Am in 1980, which didn't exactly help Pan Am when they did merge. Even though the merger was forced, the airline wasn't necessarily doing well as it was and was close to going out of business. In this video, I will discuss the uprise and downfall of National Airlines, their merger with Pan Am and why it came to be, and how this merger helped Pan Am in no way. The history of National Airlines began in 1934 when it was founded by 35-year-old George T. Baker, with services beginning that same year from Tampa to Jacksonville using Orion Brougham. A year later, they started obtaining new turboprop aircraft such as the Lockheed Model 10 Electra and the Stinson Trimotor. The airline then proceeded to expand its route network throughout Florida, moving its headquarters twice from St. Petersburg to Jacksonville in 1939. By the end of the decade, the airline was able to have the Miami to New Orleans route dubbed the Buccaneer route. During World War II, George Baker was able to win a route from Miami to New York and Washington, D.C., with stopovers in important naval bases such as Charleston, South Carolina, or Savannah, Georgia. After this war, in 1946, National decided to open up yet another route to compete with its hardest competitor, Eastern Airlines, using DC-4s from Miami to New York non-stop. As the 1950s went on, National Airlines quickly obtained many new aircraft and many new routes to Houston, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, which made them a transcontinental airline. In 1960, National Airlines obtained their first jet aircraft, the Douglas DC-8, with services beginning between Florida and San Francisco or Los Angeles. With the death of George Baker in 1963, Bud Maytag, the grandson of Frederick Maytag, who was the founder of the Maytag Corporation, took over the airline. Under his leadership, the airline rapidly expanded. In 1964, the airline introduced its second jet aircraft, the Boeing 727, which was the next type of jet that would modernize the airline's fleet along with the DC-8 to replace all of its current turboprops. On June 16, 1970, the airline introduced its first international European route, making it the third American transatlantic airline using a DC-8-60, which would later be served by a DC-10-30. The airline would then proceed to take in its first wide-body aircraft and the largest in its fleet in the fall of 1970, the Boeing 747, with opening services from Miami to New York or Los Angeles. That same year, the airline opened up its terminal at JFK Airport, dubbed the Sundrome. 1 year later, National received the McDonnell Douglas DC-10, which was one of their backbone airplanes for their long-range services. 2 years later, in 1973, the airline would receive the first of their DC-10-30s, which allowed the airline to expand to their European routes, such as Miami to Paris in 1977, Miami to Amsterdam in 1978, and Miami to Zurich in 1979.
An airline that now flies to 36 of the sunniest, brightest cities on 2 continents.
We're shining brighter!
And starting December 13th, National flies non-stop from New York to Amsterdam.
We're shining brighter!
Bringing sunshine service to National's newest route, New York, to the heart of Europe. The bigger we get,
the brighter we shine! Watch us shine!
Things seem like the airline had a bright future ahead of them from society's point of view, but on the inside of the business, the airline was in severe decline. Like many airlines, National purchased more than enough wide-body aircraft expecting a traffic boom that never came, which was costing the airline more money. In the early 1970s, Northwest Airlines and National had agreed to merge, but the United States government prohibited such a merger. The airline was even forced to shut down for months in 1975 due to a strike by flight attendants. Another thing that also didn't help National was its strange ads back in 1971 named, for example, "I'm Judy, Fly Me." This was criticized by the National Organization for Women as being sexist due to the slogan or something similar. In 1978, Frank Lorenzo, CEO of Texas Air International, purchased 24.6% of the airline's stock in hopes of buying out the airline and running it himself. When this became noticed, Pan Am attempted a takeover and knew that they would lose their opportunity if they didn't act quickly. So, Pan Am proposed a merger offering $41 per share, which was openly welcomed by National's management. At the time, National was currently trying to be merged with two airlines, and this would later get Eastern Airlines involved in this insane competition, offering a merger of their own with $50 per share. After months of negotiations, Frank Lorenzo agreed on Pan Am's merger with National, and the airline formally merged on January 7, 1980, marking the end of National's 46-year services. This merger may have seemed like any other merger with two major airlines. Well, not really. There was a dark side to the Pan Am merger with National that made the airline's current situation worse. To learn this, we have to understand Pan Am's current situation at the time of the merger. Pan Am's current position at the start of 1980 was not good. The airline was declining rapidly. However, it had a short turnaround into profitability from 1978 to 1979, but then lost money again. The airline was desperate to have domestic routes due to other domestic airlines such as United or American beginning to obtain some of the international routes that Pan Am had, and people were beginning to choose the other airlines. After the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, Pan Am had the opportunity to finally have domestic routes, so they decided the right thing to do was to overtake a domestic airline. Pan Am had tried doing this with many airlines, but all failed, so they turned to National. Now, to Pan Am's credit, they didn't have the money to start their own domestic system from the ground up, seeing as they were losing enough money as it was, and the current amount would ultimately put them out of business. However, one factor of the merger showed how greedy Pan Am was. CEO of Pan Am, William Sewell, had caught on to Pan Am's desperateness for a domestic system and how Pan Am had tried to merge with National in the past, and decided that this would be the time to grasp that opportunity with no delays whatsoever. To spread the word on how badly Pan Am wanted to merge with National, the airline was selling button pins stating, "We have the urge to merge," and Sewell stated, "I want those orange pukes out of the sky." And finally, after Pan Am merged with National, Pan Am got domestic routes, but this came at a big cost. The merger became disastrous for Pan Am. The problems for Pan Am that were caused by this merger were the combination of Pan Am and National's workforces and having to increase the wages of National's unionized workers. Another problem with this was when Pan Am and National merged, Pan Am took over National Airlines' Sundrome at JFK Airport, which operated 17 flights per day from its 12 gates. Pan Am would go into a partnership with US Air, and both airlines would share a few terminals at the airport until Pan Am terminated the partnership and would eventually sell the Sundrome to TWA. Another flaw that this merger had was the domestic destinations that National had were only in the southern part of America, not in destinations such as Atlanta, Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Louis, or Denver, which contained high levels of business travelers, and the only Midwest destination Pan Am had was to Detroit, Michigan. While all these factors occurred within a short amount of time after the merger, competitors saw TWA and Air Florida were infringing on Pan Am, as well as when Frank Lorenzo overtook Continental Airlines in 1981, forming Texas Air Corporation, which also severely infringed on Pan Am with their new routes in Houston, Florida, and California. This is not what Pan Am expected, since they intended to merge with a domestic airline that had domestic routes connecting to their international flights. Nevertheless, Pan Am had suspended most of their new domestic routes from National in 1984, and sold most of the fleet they obtained from National to United Airlines when Pan Am sold their Pacific division in 1985. This merger was one of the worst company mergers in that period, that it made the top 7 worst mergers of the 1970s, according to Fortune magazine. The debt from National Airlines from their routes didn't go away after Pan Am closed them, which also hit the airline hard. Pan Am would continue to struggle for years until finally the airline would cease operations on December 4th, 1991. The conclusion that can be drawn from this merger is that it was one of the biggest factors to the end of Pan Am, and that would have been best if they didn't merge with National. Now, the downfall of Pan Am is a very long story, and I think it'd be best if it was just its own video. And I've wasted almost half of the video just describing the drastic effects of Pan Am's merger with National. So the downfall of Pan Am would most likely have to be set aside for a later date. Well, that's going to be it. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing with all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you believe that there were any important details of the airline or the merger that I missed, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can DM me on Discord or Reddit, and yes, I do respond to the majority of my direct messages. Alright, that's going to do it for today, guys. I'll see you in the next one.